Welcome back to the Remedify Coaching Program. You know, we always love to do these deep dives, and today's topic is something really interesting that you shared with us. It's the idea of, well, you called it church in the house.
Yeah, church in the house.
We've got all your materials right here, and we're really excited to explore this with you. We want to understand the core principles behind it, the historical roots of it, you know, where it all comes from, and then also the potential impact that it has. But as always, we want to keep it accessible and not get lost in the weeds.
Right? Yeah,
So let's jump right in. What do you say?
absolutely. I'm eager to dive in with you. The material that you've shared with me, it's titled Church in the House 1.pdf. And it really lays out a vision for a very simple, very participatory, and actually a very easily reproducible form of church, which I think is really interesting. So we're going to be looking at the key characteristics of this, the scriptural basis that it's founded on, and the practical implications of this model.
Okay, I like it. I think this is going to be a good one. I'm ready to have some aha moments. Let's see if we can connect some dots here.
I think we will.
So why don't we start with just laying out some of these core principles of house churches as they're presented here in the material. And one of the first things that jumps out to me is that there's a huge emphasis on everyone participating. It's not just about showing up and listening, right?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Participation is key in this model, and it's something that sets it apart from maybe more traditional approaches to church. So in a house church, everyone's encouraged to get involved. It's like everyone is bringing something to the table and everyone has a role to play. So whether that's singing praises, to Jesus, or praying for each other, ministering, with the gifts of the Spirit, or just offering practical help, or even sharing meals together, which is, kind of like celebrating the Lord's Supper, right? It's all about being active participants. It's less about, passively sitting in a pew and more about everyone contributing, kind of like you would if you were, having a meal with your family, everyone sort of pitching in.
Yeah, yeah. I love that analogy. And it really does feel like that ties directly into that next point, which is the importance of every individual.
Hmm.
This isn't just a system where you have, the leadership at the top and then everyone else sort of below that.
That's right.
It really does seem to value the contribution of each person.
Exactly. And, it directly contradicts the idea that, well, some people are more important than others within the church. The material stresses that everyone is important in this type of church and everybody has a role to play. And I think it's really refreshing to see that kind of emphasis.
Absolutely, yeah. And the next core principle here is the focus on communal Bible engagement.
Yes.
So it's reading and discussing the Bible together as a community. And that's interesting to me. How do you think that might differ from the way many of us have experienced Bible engagement in a, more traditional church setting?
I think it differs quite a bit because, think about your own experience. In a traditional church, you might be listening to a sermon, one person delivering a message, right?
Mm.
But in a house church, engaging with the Bible becomes, a much more shared and interactive experience. It's like everyone's gathering around the table and they're exploring the scriptures together and different viewpoints emerge, different insights are shared. And I think as a result, you can come to a much deeper and more personal understanding of the text. And when you think about it, it probably helps to make the Bible more relevant and applicable to everyday life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. It does feel like it makes it more, well, alive, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not just this static thing that you're hearing, but it's something that you're actively engaging with.
Yeah. And I think that the next point that you have there, the idea of mutual encouragement, that sort of flows naturally from this communal engagement.
Yeah. And it feels like that idea of encouragement is kind of woven throughout all these different principles.
It is. It is. It's really the driving force behind everything, at least as presented in the materials here.
Hmm.
So, all the activities that they're doing, they're ultimately designed to, to build each other up in faith.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And to create a really supportive and positive environment. It's about encouraging and strengthening one another in their walk with Jesus.
Yeah, that's great. Now, they also talk a lot about the importance of prayer.
Yes.
They really emphasize having an extensive prayer life that covers everything, from their own personal needs to even praying for the well-being of, national leaders.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive approach to prayer.
It is. And I mean, I think it speaks to the house church's deep reliance on God. It's about actively interceding, for all sorts of different needs, whether they are, very personal and private needs, or whether it's, the needs of the church, their families, their relatives, their neighbors, even, national leaders. They're praying for everything. That's like a culture of prayer that permeates everything they do.
Yeah, yeah. I like that a lot. Now, they also talk about leadership, and the model that's presented here is really interesting to me. It's self-supporting, locally trained elders who function as servant leaders.
Right.
What do you make of that? What's the thinking behind structuring leadership this way?
Well, I think it's really fascinating because it suggests that, leadership should arise naturally from within the community itself. And these elders, they're really seen as servants first and foremost,
Okay.
not as like professional clergy who are sort of set apart from the rest of the congregation, which, is how it's often done in more traditional church settings.
Yeah.
And the self-supporting aspect, that's really interesting too. It's like, it contributes to that grassroots feel and, it potentially reduces the financial burden on the church, because you don't have to pay salaries and things like that. And I mean, I think it fosters this sense of shared ownership, where everyone feels like they're a part of something.
Absolutely, yeah. And I also, along with the self-supporting elders, it goes on to talk about, love, accountability, mutual support.
Yes.
It really creates this picture of a very relational and interconnected community, doesn't it?
It does. It does. It paints this beautiful picture of a community where, people are deeply committed to one another. They love each other in very practical ways. They're holding each other accountable in this, gentle and supportive kind of way.
Mhm.
They're offering help when someone's in need. And, they're even willing to, pour out their lives for each other, which is pretty powerful. And it makes sense that this deep level of commitment would create these strong bonds, because they're all in this journey together.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not just about the community itself. It's about, who they are in the broader context of what church actually is, right? And at a fundamental level here, it seems like there's a shift from defining church as being about a building or an institution and more towards the people, right? It's that fundamental shift in definition.
Yeah, it's a really significant distinction, and it's at the very heart of the house church concept. So in this model, they see believers, they see them as the people of God, they're brought together, they're unified through Christ's sacrifice and, the physical building where they happen to meet, that really becomes secondary to the fact that they're gathering together in his name.
Yeah, yeah. And that understanding, of course, leads very naturally into that vision for multiplication, which is, the house church is actively starting new churches.
Yeah.
So it's not just about growing one particular community, but it's about spreading and replicating these communities.
Precisely. It's about organic growth. Like you said, it's built in. So the vision here, it's for each house church to give birth, I guess you could say, to new churches.
Right.
And these new churches, they can pop up in different homes and offices and schools, all sorts of places. And so it becomes this, network of interconnected and growing fellowships, which is, really pretty cool when you think about it.
Yeah, I love that image. And it's not just growth for the sake of growth. There's also this commitment to growing in purity and effectiveness.
That's right.
So it's not just about numbers.
Right. It's about spiritual health and,
Oh.
the impact that they're making in the world.
Yeah.
So there's this continual desire to grow spiritually, both individually and collectively, and to be effective in living out their mission, whatever that mission might be.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that really struck me in the material is that there's this great sense of humility, like an acknowledgement that they're not perfect.
Yes.
They're not claiming to have arrived at some, ultimate destination. And they emphasize the importance of continuous learning through Bible study. I thought that was really refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a mark of maturity. That there's a real recognition here that they're on a journey and they're learning as they go,
Well,
They haven't got it all figured out and they're open to being shaped by the word, which I think creates this environment where people feel comfortable, sharing their questions and wrestling with things.
yeah, yeah. That's good. Now, the focus here is obviously on the house church model, but it's not presented as some sort of isolationist movement, right?
Right.
Because they really stress the importance of connecting with the wider body of Christ, relating to all believers, not just the ones who are part of this specific house church network. And they even encourage people to attend other Christian gatherings.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it's not about creating these little islands of believers,
Mm.
who are kind of separate from everyone else.
Yeah,
There's this real desire to connect with and support the broader Christian community in their area. And, they recognize that there are different ways to express faith, and that's a good thing.
absolutely, yeah. Now, they also talk about their belief in and submission to spiritual authority, including like citywide elders.
Right.
And there's this sense of responsibility to God and each other in fulfilling commitments.
Right.
It seems to be this balance between like local autonomy and broader connection.
Yeah, it's like walking this tightrope. On the one hand, you have the local expression of church in these individual homes. But on the other hand, there's this recognition that, there needs to be some level of broader spiritual leadership and accountability that extends beyond the individual house church. And so they talk about these, citywide elders who provide that kind of oversight and guidance.
Yeah, yeah. And all of this really feeds into that ultimate vision of saturation church planting, right?
Exactly.
Which is this idea of forming churches everywhere, in every neighborhood, in every city, in every nation, basically.
Yeah.
And they see the house church as, well, they present it as a really effective tool for achieving that.
Yes, saturation church planting. That's the ultimate goal. To see vibrant churches, vibrant church communities established everywhere. And the house church model is seen as, a way to achieve this through evangelism, discipleship, and missions. And it's something that can be, scaled and replicated really effectively, which makes it, really exciting, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's really ambitious vision, but I like it. I like where they're going with it. So now that we've talked about the core principles, let's turn our attention to the scriptural basis that they lay out here.
Okay.
And they really point to some very specific New Testament examples, don't they?
They do, they do. And these passages, they're pretty straightforward, like you said. They're direct.
Right.
And they specifically point to Romans 16.3, 1 Corinthians 16.1a, and Colossians 4.15, and Philemon 1 and 2. And all of these passages, they specifically mention churches meeting in homes. And it's not presented as, this strange thing like, oh, there's this weird exception to the rule where some people are meeting in homes. No, this is presented as the norm.
Yeah.
This was an accepted practice in the early church.
Yeah. Yeah. And they even go on to talk about how, how much easier it is to start a house church than it is to start, a more traditional church. And they highlight the fact that you don't need to have a dedicated property, an elaborate building.
Right.
You don't need all the traditional infrastructure. It really is about getting back to the essentials, right?
It is. It's a real contrast to, how we often think of church today, with the buildings, the programs, all of that. And so the material, it kind of challenges us to think about that, What have we added over the centuries?
Yeah.
What's essential and what's not? And they even ask this really thought-provoking question. What were the names of the churches that Paul started?
Yeah.
Were they called like First Baptist Church of Corinth or something like that? And the answer is, of course, no, they weren't.
Yeah.
So, it really emphasizes the simplicity of the early church. And it makes you think about, what things have we maybe added that we don't really need? Like pulpits and pews, hymn books, even things like, a fixed meeting place or a formal name for the church. All of that is optional.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes sense when you think about the impact that this simplicity can have.
Right.
And they talk about that, right?
Yeah.
They say that it creates a more relaxed and informal atmosphere.
Right.
And that house churches can be these really effective tools for evangelism.
Right. Yeah.
And that makes sense, especially when you're trying to reach people who might feel intimidated, by a more formal setting.
That's exactly right. The informality, the relational aspects, it all makes it much less intimidating, especially for people who are, brand new to faith or who might be hesitant about, going to a traditional church,
Yeah.
And the small scale, it allows for, more personal connections, and it's easier to, to provide more tailored discipleship that way.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And they also suggest that house churches provide this really natural environment for training pastors and leaders, which I think is an interesting thought as well.
Yeah, and it's really different from, the more formal institutional training that we often see today. So
Yep.
in a house church, it's more about, learning by doing. You're mentored by those who are more experienced. You're given opportunities to serve and to lead in a safe environment. So it's more like an apprenticeship,
Yeah, yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. And, speaking of that close-knit environment, I mean, obviously these small groups of people meeting regularly in homes, they're going to build some really strong bonds with each other.
Right.
And I think that's so vital for a healthy church.
Absolutely. They're sharing meals together, they're praying together, they're supporting each other, they're even holding each other accountable. So, they're going to develop these deep, meaningful relationships and a strong sense of belonging. It's like a family, really.
Yeah, yeah. And there's also talk about the economics of it all. And,
Yes.
it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
When you don't have the huge overhead of maintaining a building,
Yeah.
you can free up a lot more resources for things like missions and mercy ministries.
Exactly. Without all those building expenses, they can channel their resources directly into outreach, into helping those in need and into supporting mission work both locally and globally. And to me, that just seems to be a much better reflection of the priorities of the early church.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I love the flexibility that they highlight, too.
Yeah.
They're not tied to a building.
Right.
They're not tied to a specific schedule.
Right.
So they can meet wherever they want, whenever they want.
Yeah, and that really opens up so many possibilities because, they can meet in homes, apartments, community centers, even outdoors.
Yeah.
And they can choose whatever day of the week works best for them. It's all about adapting to the needs of the community.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they talk about how this model is really a solution to the challenges of church growth through what they call, rapid reproduction of these baby churches.
Yeah.
So it's not just about one large congregation trying to fit more and more people in.
Yeah.
It's about starting new, smaller churches all over the place.
Exactly. It's about multiplication. And, when you think about it, there are natural limitations to how much a single building can hold.
Right.
But with house churches, it's different. When a church grows too big, you don't have to build a bigger building. You can just start new churches in other locations.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great point. Now, the material also touches on something that I found really powerful, and that is the idea that in the early church, buildings weren't the central focus. And they really used the book of Acts as a prime example of that.
Absolutely.
It's about shifting our perspective away from this idea that you have to have a building to have church.
Yeah, and they point to the fact that, the early church grew exponentially, without focusing on elaborate buildings. And, it makes you think about, what are the essentials for growth?
Yeah.
Is it the building or is it the people? Is it the programs or is it the relationships, the commitment to Christ, the engagement with the word?
Yeah, yeah. That's good. So speaking of the book of Acts, let's dive into some of the specific examples that they give of house churches in the New Testament.
Okay.
And it starts right at the beginning, with Matthew chapter 2, verse 11, where it talks about the first recorded instance of worship directed toward Jesus.
Right.
And guess where it takes place? It takes place in a house.
That's right.
So that's a pretty foundational image, don't you think?
I think it's very significant because it establishes that, the earliest instances of worship directed towards Jesus, it happened in a home, not in a temple, not in a synagogue, but in a house. And so it sets this precedent, it shows that these kinds of gatherings, these gatherings in homes, they're not some kind of, second-rate version of church.
Right.
They're part of the very fabric of early Christianity.
Yeah, yeah. And then in Matthew 8.14 and 16, it talks about Peter's house being used as a place for healing. So it's not just about, meeting for worship, but it's also a place of ministry and practical care.
Exactly. The home becomes the center for ministry, where they're addressing the needs of the community, both spiritual and physical needs.
Right, right. And then, moving on to Matthew 26.18, the very first observance of communion, it doesn't happen in a grand hall, in a temple or a synagogue. It happens in the upper room of a house.
Yeah, which again speaks to the significance of these home gatherings. Here you have this profoundly significant event, the very first communion, taking place in this very simple, intimate setting.
Yeah, and then in Mark chapter 2, verse 1, it talks about Jesus preaching to crowds.
Right.
And we often think of Jesus preaching to, massive crowds out in the open, but oftentimes it happened in a house.
That's right.
So it really blurs those lines that we sometimes draw between informal gatherings and formal ministry.
It does. It highlights that, the essence of teaching, the essence of reaching people with the gospel, it's not tied to a particular type of venue.
Right.
Jesus was just as effective in a home as he was anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, moving on to the book of Acts, one of the most powerful images, I think, is the Holy Spirit descending in a house on the day of Pentecost.
Yes.
And that's in Acts 2.1 to 2. So again, it really underscores that God's presence isn't confined to, these buildings that we've designated as holy places.
I mean, you can't get more significant than Pentecost, right?
Right.
The birth of the church, and it happens in a house.
Uh-huh.
And I think, it really symbolizes that God's dwelling place is with his people. wherever they gather together in his name.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in Acts 2.46, it talks about those early believers, and they're worshiping in the temple, but they're also worshiping in their homes.
Right.
And it says that, this contributed to the rapid growth of the church because it was so flexible and it had such a widespread presence throughout the city. So they were meeting everywhere.
Exactly. They were meeting in homes, they were meeting in the temple courts, and, they were going from house to house, and it just spread like wildfire.
Right.
It was organic, it was flexible, and it was mobile.
Yeah, yeah. And the fact that Saul actually targeted these house churches, as it says in Acts 8.3, really shows that these gatherings were seen as legitimate expressions of the church, not just some, informal gathering of friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Saul was actively persecuting these house churches.
Right.
So clearly they were seen as a threat, They were seen as the real deal, as the true expression of Christianity. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered.
Yeah. And then in Acts chapter 10, we have the account of Cornelius, the Roman centurion, and he's the first Gentile to accept Christ. And guess where it happens? It happens in his house.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
This pivotal moment, it signifies that the gospel is reaching out to all nations.
Right.
And it happens in a home.
Yeah. And then in Acts 19, it mentions Paul starting churches in houses. So this seems to have been his primary way of, planting these new communities of believers.
Exactly. And, the material even raises this thought-provoking question about whether, some of the things that we've added to church structure over the centuries, whether those things have actually slowed down the growth of the church.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thought. Now, Acts 16.40 talks about Lydia's house, and this is considered by many to be the first church in Europe. So again, it highlights the role that these homes played in, taking the church to new places.
Exactly. And, we see that pattern again and again as the gospel spread. It took root in homes.
Yeah. And then Acts 5 and Acts 12, there are accounts of prayer meetings taking place in houses. And these prayers actually lead to Peter's deliverance.
Yeah.
So it really shows the power of prayer in these, more intimate settings.
Absolutely. Prayer was absolutely vital in the early church, and it's no surprise that homes were central to this.
Yeah. And finally, we see in Acts 28, even when Paul's under house arrest in Rome, he's still using his rented house as a base for teaching and ministry.
Right.
So even in difficult circumstances, the church is still functioning in a home.
And that's, the resilience of this model, right? Even when things are tough, even when there's persecution, the church continues to thrive in homes. And I think that's a really powerful lesson for us today, especially in the face of, some of the challenges that churches are facing.
Yeah, yeah. And the material really hammers home the point that the early church, it began in homes. It grew rapidly in homes. And this was because of the simplicity, the fluidity, the mobile nature of it all.
Mm-hmm.
It also really emphasizes the relationships, the fact that it wasn't a building.
Yeah.
And they point to Hebrews and 1 Corinthians to support the point that, in the New Testament, believers are actually the temple of God.
Yeah, we are the temple. And I love the idea that maybe instead of investing in, these huge church buildings, maybe we should be investing in business centers.
Yeah.
And using the profits from those businesses to help the poor, to support missions. It's a radical idea,
It is.
But it's really thought-provoking, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the material points to John 4.0 to 24, where Jesus talked about how true worship isn't about a specific location, but it's about worshiping God in spirit and in truth.
Right. It's about the heart.
Right. So you don't need a mountain. You don't need a temple.
But it's not about the place. It's about the posture of the heart.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, I think it's interesting how they address this very basic question.
Yeah.
What is a church?
Yeah.
And they start by looking at the Greek word ecclesia.
Right.
And they define it as called out from, which is interesting because it's not a religious term. It was just a general term for, an assembly.
Yeah, it was a secular term.
Yeah.
It could refer to any kind of assembly of citizens who were called out for a particular purpose.
Right, right. And then they go on to say that really the church is the people moving together under the leadership of Christ. And they draw from Ephesians 1 for that.
Yes.
And that really emphasizes that it's not a building, it's not an institution, it's the people.
Yeah, it's a living, breathing community. It's dynamic.
Yeah. And they even address the question of parachurch organizations and congregations. And they say that, if they're gathering under the lordship of Christ, then they can be considered churches too.
Yeah, it's a really inclusive understanding, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And they point to Matthew 18:20, where it says, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst."
Right, which is such a powerful reminder that, you don't need a crowd, you don't need a building, you just need a couple of people gathered in Jesus' name, and he's present.
Yeah, I love that verse. So then they talk about the role of leaders in the church. And one of the points they make is that the gifts mentioned in Ephesians 4, they were given to an existing church.
Right.
So the community comes first.
Exactly. The community comes first, and then the leadership gifts are given to equip that community and to serve that community.
Yeah. And in Acts 14:21-23, it talks about elders being ordained in every church.
Mm,
And they point out that these weren't necessarily professional clergy.
right.
They were just respected leaders,
Yeah.
chosen from within the community itself.
Yeah, it's a very different model from what we often see today, where you have, seminaries and, professional training for pastors.
Right.
In the early church, it was much more organic.
Yeah. And, speaking of things we've added to the church over the centuries, there's a real caution here in the material about, getting too caught up in rituals and forms and ceremonies and religiosity. And they talk about institutionalism and legalism.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that sometimes these things can obscure the simplicity of what church is all about.
It's about getting back to the heart of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
The core relationship with Christ, the genuine connection with each other.
Yeah. And they offer this really nice definition of a house church. They say it's simply a church that meets in a house. It's a center for evangelism and discipleship, and it's connected to the wider body of Christ. It's flexible and adaptable in its meeting place.
Right.
And it follows the New Testament practice of seeking to know and follow God's will through prayer. So a really nice, concise definition.
Yeah, it captures the essence of it, the simplicity, the relational focus, the missional heart, and the adaptability. And it's all rooted in the New Testament.
Yeah. And they emphasize that a house church, it can even start before a formal church planter arrives, which is really cool
Right.
because it speaks to that, that grassroots, organic nature of it all.
It's like, the spark for a new church can come from anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, they also delve into the idea of membership. And they talk about how, in Acts, it says that it was the Lord who added to the church.
Right.
So it wasn't this human process of signing up or joining a membership role.
It's about spiritual birth,
Yeah.
It's about being born again and being added to God's family through faith.
Yeah. And then they raise this interesting concept about the idea that, those early Christians, they might have considered themselves members of the whole.